Christina Onassis died alone in a bathtub in Buenos Aires on November 19, 1988. She was only 37 years old, and at the time of her death, she controlled a fortune worth over $500 million. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack brought on by years of drug abuse and an eating disorder that had destroyed her body. But the woman who died that day had once been called the richest girl in the world, a princess of the jet-set era, and the sole heir to one of the most powerful shipping empires ever built. Before we continue, subscribe for real stories about wealth, power, and the dark side of famous families. Her body was found by her maid in the morning, slumped over in the tub with the water still running. There were no signs of struggle, no suicide note, nothing that would suggest anything other than a tragic but natural death. The Argentine authorities performed an autopsy and closed the case within days. But the speed of that investigation, combined with the strange circumstances of her final weeks, left many people wondering if there was more to the story than what was officially reported. Christina had spent her entire life running from something, and in the end, it caught up with her in the most ordinary way possible. She died the way she had lived for most of her adult life, which is to say completely alone despite being surrounded by people who wanted something from her. The irony of her death was that it happened in Argentina, a country she had moved to specifically because she thought she could finally find peace there, away from the reporters and the fortune hunters and the endless parade of people who saw her as nothing more than a walking bank account. Christina Maria Onassis was born on December 11, 1950 in New York City, though she would spend very little of her childhood in any one place. Her father was Aristotle Onassis, a Greek shipping magnate who had built his fortune through a combination of ruthless business tactics and an almost supernatural ability to be in the right place at the right time. Her mother was Athena Livanos, who came from another powerful Greek shipping family, which meant that Christina's birth was less of a happy family moment and more of a merger between two business dynasties. From the very beginning, Christina's life was defined by wealth on a scale that most people cannot even comprehend. The Onassis family owned a private island in Greece called Scorpios, a yacht called the Christina that was longer than a football field, and properties scattered across Europe and America. Aristotle Onassis was one of the richest men in the world, and he made sure everyone knew it. He threw parties that attracted movie stars, politicians, and royalty. He dated opera singers and Hollywood actresses. He was, in every sense of the word, larger than life. But for Christina, growing up in that world meant growing up without anything resembling a normal childhood. She was shuffled between boarding schools and vacation homes, rarely spending more than a few weeks in any one location. Her parents' marriage was a disaster from the start, filled with screaming matches and infidelities on both sides. Aristotle was emotionally distant and more interested in his business empire than in his children. Her mother, Athena, was cold and critical, constantly telling Christina that she was too fat, too awkward, too much of a disappointment. Christina had an older brother named Alexander, and he was the only person in her early life who seemed to genuinely care about her. Alexander was being groomed to take over the family business, which meant he got most of their father's attention, but he never treated Christina the way the rest of the family did. He protected her from their parents' worst impulses and tried to give her some sense of normalcy in a life that was anything but normal. The bond between them was the only real emotional anchor Christina had during her childhood, and this is only the beginning of her downfall. If you're following the story so far, make sure you're subscribed. There's much more coming. In 1973, when Christina was just 22 years old, her brother Alexander died in a plane crash. He had been piloting a small aircraft when it went down shortly after takeoff, and the circumstances of the crash were suspicious enough that many people believed it had been sabotaged. Alexander had been involved in a dispute with his father over business matters, and there were rumors that Aristotle's enemies had decided to strike at him through his son. Whether those rumors were true or not, the effect on the Onassis family was devastating. Aristotle Onassis was never the same after Alexander's death. The man who had built an empire through sheer force of will seemed to crumble overnight. He became paranoid and depressed, convinced that there was a curse on his family and that he would lose everything he had worked for. Christina, meanwhile, lost the only person who had ever truly loved her unconditionally. She spiraled into depression and began using drugs and alcohol to numb the pain. She also developed an eating disorder, binging and purging in a desperate attempt to achieve the impossible standards of beauty that her mother had drilled into her since childhood. The death of Alexander marked the beginning of what many people would later call the Onassis curse, a pattern of tragedy and early death that seemed to follow the family wherever they went. Christina's mother, Athena, died less than a year after Alexander from what was officially ruled as a drug overdose, though there were whispers that it might have been suicide. Aristotle himself died in 1975, just 2 years after his son, from complications related to myasthenia gravis, a disease that had been slowly destroying his body. At the age of 24, Christina Onassis became the sole heir to her father's fortune and the head of one of the most powerful business empires in the world. Inheriting the Onassis fortune should have been the ultimate dream, but for Christina, it was more like a nightmare. She was suddenly responsible for managing a shipping empire that employed thousands of people and generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue every year. She had no training in business, no real education beyond the boarding schools she had been shuffled through, and no one in her life who could teach her how to navigate the cutthroat world of international shipping. The executives who had worked for her father saw her as a naive young woman who could be easily manipulated, and they were right. Christina tried to take control of the business, but she was overwhelmed from the start. She made poor decisions, trusted the wrong people, and watched helplessly as the empire her father had built began to crumble. The shipping industry was changing, and the tactics that had worked for Aristotle in the 1950s and 60s no longer applied in the modern era. Christina knew she was in over her head, but her pride and her desperate need to prove herself kept her from admitting it or asking for help. At the same time, Christina was dealing with an invasion of her personal life that would have broken most people. As soon as she inherited the fortune, she became a target for every con artist, gold digger, and fortune hunter in Europe. Men who had never given her a second glance suddenly found her irresistible. Women who had mocked her weight and appearance now wanted to be her best friend. Everyone wanted something from her, and Christina, who had spent her entire life desperate for love and acceptance, couldn't tell the difference between genuine affection and manipulation. She married for the first time in 1971, before her father's death, to a Los Angeles real estate developer named Joseph Bolker. Aristotle was furious about the marriage and did everything in his power to destroy it, including cutting Christina off financially and threatening Bolker's business interests. The marriage lasted less than a year. After her father died, Christina married 3 more times, each marriage more disastrous than the last. Her second husband was a Greek shipping heir named Alexander Andreadis, but that marriage fell apart within months. Her third husband was a Russian shipping agent named Sergei Kausov, and that marriage was so brief that most people forgot it even happened. Christina's fourth and final marriage was to a French pharmaceutical heir named Thierry Roussel, and it was perhaps the most destructive relationship of her life. Roussel was everything Christina thought she wanted in a man. He was handsome, charming, and came from a wealthy family, which meant he wasn't just after her money. At least that's what Christina told herself. The truth was far more complicated. Roussel did want Christina's money, but more than that, he wanted the power and status that came with being married to the Onassis heiress. He convinced Christina that he loved her, and she believed him because she wanted so desperately for it to be true. They married in 1984, and for a brief moment, Christina thought she had finally found the happiness that had eluded her for so long. She gave birth to a daughter named Athena in 1985, and becoming a mother seemed to give Christina a sense of purpose she had never had before. But the marriage was doomed from the start. Roussel was openly unfaithful, carrying on a very public affair with a Swedish model named Gabi Landhage. He didn't even bother to hide it, and the tabloids had a field day reporting on his infidelities, while Christina watched her marriage disintegrate. She tried to hold it together for the sake of her daughter, but the emotional toll was devastating. Her eating disorder worsened, her drug use increased, and she began to withdraw from the few friends she had left. Roussel knew he had leverage over Christina because of their daughter, Athena. He used the child as a weapon, threatening to take her away if Christina didn't give him more money or more control over the Onassis fortune. Christina was terrified of losing her daughter the way she had lost everyone else in her life, so she gave in to his demands again and again. She signed over control of portions of her fortune, bought him properties, and essentially funded his affair with Landhage. The more she gave, the more he took, and the more worthless she felt. By 1987, Christina's life had become almost unbearable. Her marriage to Roussel was over in everything but name, though they hadn't officially divorced yet. She was locked in a bitter custody battle over Athena, and Roussel was using every dirty trick in the book to gain the upper hand. He painted Christina as an unfit mother, pointing to her history of drug abuse and mental instability as proof that she shouldn't have custody. The courts seemed to side with him, and Christina was slowly losing access to the one person in the world she truly loved. Her business empire was falling apart as well. The executives who ran the Onassis shipping companies had essentially taken control, pushing Christina to the sidelines and treating her like a figurehead rather than the owner. She still had her fortune, of course, but the power and respect that should have come with it were gone. She was a joke in the business world, a cautionary tale about what happens when someone inherits wealth without earning it. Christina's physical health was deteriorating rapidly. Years of drug abuse, bulimia, and emotional trauma had taken a terrible toll on her body. She had gained and lost hundreds of pounds over the years, cycling through extreme diets and binge-eating episodes that left her exhausted and sick. Her heart was weak, her liver was damaged, and she was taking a cocktail of prescription medications just to function on a daily basis. Friends who saw her during this period said she looked like a ghost of her former self, hollow-eyed and frail despite her weight. In the summer of 1988, Christina made the decision to move to Argentina. She told people she was going there to be closer to one of her business interests, but the real reason was simpler than that. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to go somewhere where people didn't know who she was, where she could walk down the street without being recognized, where she could maybe, finally, find some kind of peace. Argentina seemed like the perfect escape, far enough from Europe that the tabloids wouldn't follow her, but cosmopolitan enough that she wouldn't feel completely isolated. Christina arrived in Buenos Aires in the fall of 1988 and rented a modest home in the Tortuguitas neighborhood, far from the wealthy districts where most expatriates lived. She brought very few staff with her, just a maid and a driver, and she made it clear that she wanted to be left alone. For the first few weeks, she seemed almost happy. She went for walks, visited local cafes, and tried to live something resembling a normal life. People who encountered her during this period said she was friendly but distant, like someone who was trying very hard to pretend everything was fine. But Christina couldn't outrun her problems, no matter how far she traveled. The custody battle with Roussel continued, with lawyers calling her at all hours demanding documents and depositions. The business empire back in Europe required constant attention, and the executives who ran it treated her like an annoyance rather than their boss. Her health continued to decline, and she was taking more medication than ever just to sleep through the night. The dream of peace in Argentina was just that, a dream, and reality kept intruding no matter how hard she tried to ignore it. In mid-November, Christina received news that the courts in France had ruled in Roussel's favor on a key custody issue. She would be allowed to see her daughter only under supervised visits, and even those would be limited to a few hours a week. The news devastated her. Friends who spoke to her during those final days said she sounded defeated, like she had finally given up on the idea that things would ever get better. She stopped going out, stopped eating properly, and spent most of her time alone in her rented house, staring at the walls and wondering how her life had come to this. On the night of November 18, 1988, Christina Onassis went to bed early. She had spent the day dealing with lawyers and business matters, and she was exhausted both physically and emotionally. Her maid later reported that Christina seemed more withdrawn than usual, but not in a way that suggested anything was seriously wrong. She took her usual medications, ran a bath to help her relax, and closed the door to her bedroom. It was the last time anyone saw her alive. What happened in those final hours remains a mystery. The official story is that Christina had a heart attack while in the bathtub and drowned before anyone could help her. The autopsy found high levels of barbiturates and other drugs in her system, consistent with the medications she had been prescribed for anxiety and insomnia. The Argentine authorities ruled her death accidental and closed the investigation quickly, too quickly for some people's comfort. But there were details about Christina's death that didn't quite add up. For one thing, she had been in relatively good spirits the week before, making plans for the future and talking about fighting the custody ruling. For another, the autopsy report was sealed almost immediately, and the family refused to allow any independent investigation into her death. Roussel, who stood to gain control of the Onassis fortune through his daughter, seemed almost relieved when he heard the news. He didn't attend the funeral, claiming he needed to protect Athena from the media circus, but many people saw it as a calculated move to distance himself from any suspicion. There were also rumors, never substantiated, that Christina had been meeting with someone in the days before her death, someone connected to the business interests she had been threatening to expose. The Onassis empire had been built on deals that existed in the gray areas of international law, and there were people who had a vested interest in making sure Christina didn't start asking too many questions about where all the money was going. Whether those rumors had any basis in fact, or were just conspiracy theories born from the tragedy of her death, we'll probably never know. Christina Onassis was buried on her father's private island of Scorpios, next to her brother Alexander and her father Aristotle. The funeral was a massive affair, attended by dignitaries and celebrities from around the world, but the woman they were mourning had lived most of her life feeling invisible. The headlines called her death tragic, a waste of potential, the end of a dynasty, but very few, People seemed to understand or care about the person Christina had actually been, beyond the fortune she represented. Her daughter, Athena, inherited everything. At just 3 years old, she became one of the wealthiest people in the world, with a fortune estimated at over $800 million. Thierry Roussel was named as the trustee of her inheritance, which meant he had control over the Onassis fortune until Athena turned 18. He moved to Switzerland with his mistress-turned-wife Gabby Landhage and raised Athena in seclusion, keeping her away from the media and from anyone connected to the Onassis family. Critics accused him of isolating the girl to maintain control over her inheritance, but there was nothing anyone could do about it. The Onassis business empire continued for a while under professional management, but it gradually dissolved over the years. The shipping industry had changed too much, and the company couldn't compete with modern competitors. The fortune that Aristotle had built and that Christina had desperately tried to hold together eventually faded into history, leaving behind only the legend of a family that seemed cursed from the beginning. As for Athena, she grew up to be as troubled as her mother, struggling with the weight of her family's legacy and the fortune she inherited. She married young, tried to live a normal life, and failed in much the same way Christina had. The curse, if you believe in such things, seemed to have survived into the next generation. The Onassis name, once synonymous with power and glamour, became a cautionary tale about the price of wealth and the emptiness that can exist behind even the most gilded lives. More than 3 decades have passed since Christina Onassis died in that bathtub in Buenos Aires, and the questions surrounding her death have never really been answered. The official story is neat and tidy, a tragic but unsurprising end for a woman who had abused her body for years. But the people who knew Christina best have never quite accepted that explanation. They point to the timing of her death, coming just days after she received devastating news about her custody battle. They question why the autopsy was sealed and why the investigation was closed so quickly. They wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was more to the story than anyone wanted to admit. Some people believe Christina committed suicide, that the pain of losing her daughter finally became too much to bear, and she decided to end it all in the privacy of that rented house in Argentina. Others think her death was an accident, the result of mixing too many medications with alcohol in a desperate attempt to sleep through the emotional agony. And then, there are those who believe something darker happened, that Christina was murdered by people who had a financial interest in seeing her dead. The truth is, we'll probably never know for certain what happened that night. What we do know is that Christina Onassis lived a life that was tragic in ways that had nothing to do with money. She was born into wealth beyond imagination, but that wealth couldn't buy her the things she actually needed, which were love, stability, and a sense of self-worth. She was used by her family, exploited by her husbands, and manipulated by business partners who saw her as nothing more than a signature on a check. She died alone, forgotten by most of the people who had once claimed to care about her, in a country she had fled to in a desperate attempt to find peace. The story of Christina Onassis is a reminder that money, no matter how much of it you have, cannot protect you from the basic human needs for connection and meaning. It's a story about what happens when a child is raised to see themselves as nothing more than a commodity, when every relationship is transactional, and when the only value you have is tied to your bank account. Christina spent her entire life searching for someone who would love her for who she was, rather than what she was worth, and she never found that person. In the end, the richest girl in the world died with nothing that mattered. If you look at photographs of Christina Onassis from different points in her life, you can almost see the progression of her decline. There are photos from her childhood, where she looks uncomfortable and awkward, standing next to her impossibly glamorous parents. There are photos from her teenage years, where she's starting to show signs of the eating disorder that would plague her for the rest of her life. There are photos from her 20s and 30s, where you can see the exhaustion and pain in her eyes, even when she's smiling for the camera. The Onassis curse, as people called it, claimed almost everyone in the family. Alexander died in a plane crash at 24. Athena, Christina's mother, died of a drug overdose at 45. Aristotle died of disease at 69, a broken man who had outlived his only son, and Christina died at 37, her body destroyed by years of abuse and her spirit crushed by a lifetime of emotional trauma. The only survivor was Athena, Christina's daughter, and even she struggled under the weight of a legacy that seemed designed to destroy anyone who carried it. Today, very few people remember Christina Onassis, and even fewer understand who she really was. She's a footnote in the stories about her father, a tragic figure in the history of the jet-set era, a cautionary tale about inherited wealth. But she was also a person, a woman who wanted nothing more than to be loved and accepted, who tried desperately to live up to impossible expectations, and who ultimately paid the price for a life she never asked for and couldn't escape. The house in Buenos Aires where Christina died has long since been torn down. The Onassis island of Scorpios was sold years ago to a Russian billionaire. The business empire that Aristotle built has been absorbed by larger companies or dissolved entirely. The only thing that remains is the story, and even that is fading from memory as newer scandals and tragedies capture the public's attention. Christina Onassis was called many things during her life: the richest girl in the world, the Onassis heiress, a tragic figure, a cautionary tale, but perhaps the most accurate description is simply this: she was a woman who never had a chance to be anything other than what other people wanted her to be. She was born into a golden cage, and she died there, alone and forgotten, despite having more money than most people could imagine. Her story is a reminder that sometimes the worst prisons are the ones we inherit, and that no amount of wealth can buy freedom from the past. The final chapter of the Onassis dynasty ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. In a bathtub in a rented house in a foreign country, with no one around to witness the moment when one of the most famous heiresses in the world simply stopped existing. If there's a lesson in Christina's story, it's that tragedy doesn't discriminate based on bank account, and that the things that truly matter in life, love, connection, purpose, cannot be bought or inherited. They have to be earned, and Christina Onassis never got that chance. For more true stories like this, subscribe now. New documentaries every week.